Hello, I'm Mark Allen Mattis, and I'm an assistant professor in English at the University of Louisville. Today, I've invited a guest speaker, Dr. Robert Gunn, who's faculty in English at the University of Texas, El Paso. Dr. Gunn earned his PhD in English and American Literature at New York University. His teaching and research centers on North American literature and culture prior to 1900, and his focus is primarily on the evolving Western geographies of American empire in the 19th century. He's particularly interested in representations of language, race, and embodiment, the literary and scientific networks of westward expansionism, borderlands theory, and the expressive cultures of Native America. Dr. Gunn's book, Ethnology and Empire, Languages, Literature, and the Making of the North American Borderlands, was published by NYU Press in 2015 as part of the series America in the Long 19th Century, and is the winner, deservedly so, of the 2016 Early American Literature First Book Prize. Dr. Gunn is the recipient, too, of numerous fellowships, including awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Philosophical Society, the American Antiquarian Society, and the John Carter Brown Library. Whew. Hello, Robert Gunn. Thank you so much for joining me to discuss your writing and your teaching on early American literature in Native America. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Hello, Mark Mattis. I am very glad to be here and to have this conversation with you. I'm really grateful to you for the invitation and to the Department of English at the University of Louisville for hosting this and making this possible. Let me say, too, just what a fan I am of you and your work going back a lot of years now, and how much I've been looking forward to having a chance to actually sit down and take some time out of our schedules to do this. So let's do it.
Absolutely. Though I should note the generosity is all yours. All yours. So let's get into it. The reason I invited you here today, Robert, is because you're a scholar of Native America and early American studies. You're really interested in Native American studies and Indigenous studies approaches, as well as settler colonialism, and you really center your interests on language. And I think that really speaks to students in English studies who might be taking an early American studies course like my own. Here at the University of Louisville, I teach on literatures of the Northwest Territory, the Ohio Valley, early print culture in Native American literature, multi-ethnic literature, and Ethnology and Empire just hits the sweet spot for us over here. So I'm so glad I get to talk to you about it. So I just wanted to ask you some questions about your book, Ethnology and Empire, a little bit about your teaching, about your research approaches, your thinking about theories, both au courant and not in English studies, and a little bit about what's next for you.
Okay, great.
So my first question is just a getting your feet wet kind of question. I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit about how your book project came about.
Sure. So it's unusual for a first book. It is unrelated to my dissertation. I wrote a dissertation about Jefferson and Hawthorne and political theory, democratic political theory in the 19th century, and shifted the course of my research entirely when I got my first job out of graduate school, where I am now, in El Paso, Texas, and realized, in that first year with some embarrassment that although I knew a lot about New York in early America in the 19th century, and Philadelphia and Boston and maybe Charleston and some points in the Caribbean, I knew very little about the part of the world in which I had taken this job, which had this incredibly rich and does have this incredibly richly sedimented layers of history that are visible all around me. And I realized with some dismay that even though I had thought of myself as having this brand new, very current degree in the field, in many ways, my training reflected the regional biases of the discipline. So I tried to compensate for my ignorance by spending time in libraries, in our library, sitting in the shelves, looking for stuff about this part of the world. And one of the first texts that I landed on that really kind of caught my imagination, I remember, reading, sitting on the ground, was a 2-volume book by John Russell Bartlett. It was his personal narrative of explorations and incidents in the West and Southwest, Chihuahua and Texas and elsewhere, which described his stint as the U.S. Boundary Commissioner following the U.S.-Mexico War, charged with just, enforcing and marking the international boundary that was marked out according to Article 5 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Fascinating book, really well and really interesting written. He was an illustrator. And the reason I discovered that he wanted to write this book in the first place, and to have the job as boundary commissioner, was unusual. He had no business, frankly, whatsoever, running a boundary survey across thousands of miles of desert on a quasi-military expedition. His background was that he owned the best antiquarian bookstore in America, in New York City, on the ground floor of the Astor House Hotel, and co-founded with Albert Gallatin the American Ethnological Society in New York City, which at that time, was not the academic discipline that eventually gave rise to now. It was not anthropology. This is something that was run by a lot of gentlemen amateurs like himself with interest in antiquarian topics. And he thought, if I get the boundary survey, if I run that commission, I'm going to have a chance to undertake, firsthand ethnological research. And in particular, their interest was languages. But he thought this would be an opportunity to discover and to document, to record lexica of all of these previously uncontracted tribes in the continental interior, sort of south and west of the Rocky Mountains, record their vocabularies and become famous. And so that's, just as a backstory for this particular text, I was really interested in that. I began writing about this text, but I came to realize that in order to tell really that story about Bartlett, I had to tell another story about the emergence of ethnological linguistics in the 19th century and its role in acts of conquest and expansionism, things like boundary surveys, actions of the War Department, which were closely connected to the work of linguists in the 19th century. So I kind of went back in time and began to think in a couple of different, places at once about the emergence of the theory, people's theories about language, Native American languages in particular, how that was part of the intellectual life of early America in Philadelphia, the American Philosophical Society in New York, the American Ethnological Society eventually, and how this was, as I mentioned, connected to and depended on largely the larger capillary apparatus of the War Department to gather information about different tribes and their languages, but also how this was a huge preoccupation, sort of unexpectedly in some ways, for what we think of as mainstream canonical literary culture. Cooper is reading obsessively the transactions of the American Philosophical Society and incorporating things that he's found from the Venerable Heckewelder, who he name checks in his preface to Last of the Mohicans as this font of wisdom about Native peoples, right? And Heckewelder was a linguist he was a missionary and a linguist whose correspondence with Peter de Ponso was a huge part of the publication agenda of the transactions of the American Philosophical Society in the 1820s. So I'm discovering all of these things at once and wanting to tell a story about where I live now, but also wanting to explore what all of these questions about language and Western spaces and Indigenous people, how this all fits into kind of an unfolding storyline about empire and knowledge projects and different modes of ways of collecting knowledge and representing it, and finally how those things are ultimately. That's really the big thing that I think I found most compelling about this is that all these early theories about language it's another venue in which it's another set of questions in which people are obsessing about what race is and how to discern and mark boundaries of difference, right? In this moment when racial categories are being invented out of whole cloth, right? But it's a different kind of place where people tend to look at when they explore these questions, which have to do with the anatomists, right? The people who are interested in comparing skulls and measuring different body parts and stuff like that. Language is also a place where all these questions about race and race making are taking place in a really interesting way.
I'm glad that you brought up language, and I'm glad that you brought up James Fenimore Cooper. It helps me ask the next question. So, in literary studies, we're so often asked, and we also ask of our students, to attend to authors, choices with craft. And concomitant with that is a bunch of skills that we colloquially call close reading, a kind of unpacking of the moves of the text, right, in support of an argument. And I really love that you discussed the way that we can make recourse to a novelist like Hooper, but in ways that like allow a reading of the language of the text through recourse to these sociological, phenomena, right? These histories that then we can bring back to close reading in ways that aren't simply about the artistic choices of the inspired author alone or at all. And I think that's a really exciting move that students can make early American literature or any literature. I promise you there's actually a question in there, which is, I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you began to recognize the connection between, and this is your interest in ethnology and empire, in the linguistic politics at play in a work of writing or a work of art, and the need for attending to matters that extend beyond the author's craft.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question, and it's such an interesting one, and sort of working with that that slippage, right? Working with that difference is I think kind of the central kind of magnet in the way that I think about reading and what interests me about the colonial archive, because I'm interested ultimately in forms of misrecognition. It seems to be that's organized a lot of the readings that I do in this book than I do elsewhere in my work. And so I think the best example I could use to talk about that is how I became interested in sign language in the middle of all of this. Right, which is, the first place, as I mentioned, I was interested in looking at the way theorists of language and people in the War Department are going about this larger project that begins really with Jefferson to document, at least in the Americas, indigenous languages. And one of the texts, one of the expeditions in which there's a kind of a big step forward, a concerted effort to take this to a new level, is with the expedition led by Stephen Harriman Long in like 1819 or so. And they were charged with a number of things, but the main thing that they were charged to do was to sort of clarify the new boundary with when the treaty was negotiated in New Spain, but later Mexico after the revolution, of the Louisiana Purchase, right? So along the Arkansas and Red Rivers, that was one of the main places they were exploring. And one of the things they do in the work of documentation of this expedition that is eventually published is they produce the first vocabulary of what we now describe as Plains Indian Sign Language. Interestingly, they they don't record this or not. They don't look to record this alongside their record of oral languages that they're documenting, but it sort of takes place and is represented in a different place in their documentation. And I mention this because it's something that sign language has a really interesting place in the literary record of the 19th century. It is something that is prevalent. It is seen all over the place. And it is almost universally misrecognized as something that is sublinguistic, that is not linguistic at all. That is something like pantomime, right? The way people describe it is that it's like a pseudo-theatrical technique that they notice indigenous people tend to practice, but they assume that it is an auxiliary to speech, or it is a compensation for what was presumed to be an impoverishment of indigenous languages. So they would have to compensate by using their hands and so forth. And moreover, that it was something that that people like white people encountering explorers or missionaries, travelers, soldiers could simply learn to do by like just pretending, by playing charades. But what they're describing as variously gesture or gesticulation is in fact a fully developed linguistic system. It is a conventionalized system with its own grammar, its own morphology that would not be recognized by a linguist as a language until the latter half of the 20th century, right? So what you see in a lot of very literary accounts of travel and expedition are just including Lewis and Clark, including stuff on the Long Expedition and elsewhere, people describing something that they are misrecognizing, right? And the thing that these texts actually do is that they're sort of incidentally archiving and documenting indigenous speech acts, but they are not recognized by the authors of those texts in their own, crafted literary language. as such, right? That they're seen as something that's completely different. And so I think it struck me that there was an opportunity to develop a way of approaching these texts with a different interpreted method in mind that had an eye towards thinking beyond the limits of what that author, him or herself, might be able to see at any one moment, right? To what the text might actually contain or reference. And that in turn takes me, it takes you past the text, even as it asks and draws upon and rewards the skills that you and I were trained to develop as literary scholars, right? I mean, the way into some of these questions is very much through the skills that we develop to interpret and to think more deeply about literary language. But it's in this instance, in thinking about the incidental archive of things that are linguistic but unrecognized, misrecognized, it takes you beyond this text into a different kind of social reality, right? Different.
Yeah, and I love the idea that like your method is a search for the significance of misrecognition in some ways, if I'm allowed to say that.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Because it's a great way of saying there's actually something generative about these like crises of knowledge, implicit ones that are recognized by their interlocutors, but ones that go unrecognized perhaps for 150, 200 years until Robert Gunn writes a book. But nonetheless, like it's a great way of thinking of reading for misrecognition without it devolving into the hermeneutics of suspicion. And I think it's so often the case that when we meet students where they're at, sometimes where they're at is, I couldn't find the hidden meaning of the text. But it's not that at all, right? It's the way in which there was a relationship to text making that produced perhaps even these very myopias. I was stunned, not surprised, but stunned at the same time, of course, that there was this privileging of verbal speech over and against signing, right? In this moment of misrecognition, that's logocentrism of writing over speech, which is so often the case in the way that oral cultures and the knowledges they curate are legitimized in colonial writing. And we see that process like, twofold, a kind of Russian nesting doll of these hierarchical processes of privileging one media practice over another, and then again. So I just found that, just really compelling, stunning, and not surprising at all, knowing what we know about early America. These insights of yours into signing as a linguistic practice leads me to a question in particular about your work on Hunter and Tecumseh and linguistic politics. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about, just how do you find this stuff? How do you find stuff about signing when it's not something that is explicit, say in the transcription of the oral text, right? Or how do you just simply find materials that involve some sort of contribution, whether it's authorship or compilation or translation or some sort of contribution to an early American or Indigenous archive by Native figures, when they're so often glossed over, elided, erased, marginalized in, say, reading a James Fenimore Cooper, or in, reading another like canonical settler piece of early American literature. Where do you find this stuff?
So, I mean, by hook or by crook, wherever you can. I mean, just I think, and I think you can testify to this too. Part of the fun of spending time in archives is, well, and that's good advice, I think, in general. Get to know librarians and befriend them, right? Go to archives and spend time there. Go with an open mind, right? You go to, when you were very kind to mention some of the research fellowships I had and got that I used to work on this book. And some other projects, and you go to those places when you apply for a fellowship, when you apply for a grant, it's because you have an idea of what it is that you're going to find, right? You know that there are a particular set of papers that are unpublished that are at, say, the American Philosophical Library Society, and I need to spend time in that library so I can look at the records of the Long Expedition, and look at the correspondence of Peter de Ponso, and learn about these linguists and so on and so forth. And that's all good, and I hope, and one hopes that those things pan out, but it's often the case that the stuff that really ends up changing the direction of your work is the stuff you never thought of, right? The stuff that you had no anticipation of and didn't even know to look for until you're there and you discover that what's there in a physical archive is not what you think or not what you expect, or you just follow a train of associations and you look up something else that leads you to the third thing, and then suddenly you are, as I found myself there, looking into sign languages, when that's not why I went there. I went there to look at early, like Jefferson and his skeleton vocabularies and records that came out of the Lewis and Clark expeditions, those that survived at least, and the way this fed into some other things. And instead I became preoccupied with sign language, and that totally changed the direction of my research. And it was luck in some ways. It was looking at some of the materials that the American Philosophical Society, and Peter de Ponce in particular, had generated to train the members of this military expedition, the exploring expedition, when they went out into the field, and all this stuff about like, look out for their, for the way they use sign language. But this was under, dramatic and theatrical stuff, right? And ceremony, rather than all the linguistic stuff. And I'm like, why is this over here and not there? And that led me down one road that leads me to another, that leads me to read John Donne Hunter. And John Donne Hunter was someone who is writing about, it's a famous and famously vexed captivity narrative from the early 1820s, right around the same period. So I was interested in that moment. And in which, that I knew that he talked about sign language. So I was initially looking at some of that in that text, and I've been just reading a lot of captivity narratives, but found all this stuff about Tecumseh and his record of Tecumseh's speech there. And that in turn led me to read more about Tecumseh and started connecting some things between a few different moments and drawing some lines, and things just end up falling into place. It part of it, I think, has to do with a willingness to commit yourself to a process of research when you don't know where it's going to take you, and accept the what's not clear about that, right? So that would be one in that case. And I love to talk more about these specific texts, the way John Donne Hunter, like in a classroom, works really, really well alongside Tecumseh and the thing I talk about in that chapter, the major speech that he gives to Harrison at Vincennes, right? But so, that's one kind of answer, right? Another is paying attention to and being sensitive, picking up on stuff that some of our amazing colleagues in the field are doing. One book that I mentioned in passing to you earlier that has been really inspiring to me recently is a book that's called Through Indian Sign Language, which I recommend to your students. It is a record of a series of interviews, transcriptions that a man named Hugh Lennox Scott, who was first a scout in the Army during the Plains Wars of the 1870s, and then later was the commanding officer of an Indigenous regiment at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, who, while he was scout previously, had become proficient in Plains Indian Sign Language, and who, with his collaborator, Aseo, who was a Kiowa man who was part of that same regiment, performed intake interviews for all of the prisoners who came into Fort Sill in the early 1890s. And the intake interviews were essentially open invitations to tell us your stories, tell us who you are, tell us why you're here. These were recorded in Plains Indian Sign Language. The interviews, rather, were conducted in Plains Indian Sign Language. Aseo, who is Kiowa, is fluent also in Plains Indian Sign Language. Hugh Lennox Scott is recording this stuff in ledgers, which then are left essentially untouched for more than 100 years until a scholar named William Meadows finds them, publishes them. It came out in the University of Oklahoma Press like 5 years ago now. And now any student, you or I or the students in your class, can go find all of these transcriptions of interviews with really famous, important figures, stories and speeches that they offered that ended up in a colonial archive under the most coercive possible conditions, but somehow miraculously survived into the 21st century, right? And are worth taking seriously as primary textual artifacts. Sometimes it's that. It's discovering with renewed joy every time you find it, some new incredible work of scholarship that one of our colleagues in our field or related field has done to bring things to light, right? There's a lot of great stuff out there.
I really appreciate you sharing those particular resources and just a general openness to, on the one hand, with archives, sitting with the materials and meeting them where they're at, as opposed to trying to just sort of impose, say, a narrative derived from a close reading of Jefferson onto everything you find. I think that's so important. I think you're also highlighting, too, the way in which university presses, scholars, Indigenous intellectuals, both within and outside the academy, are all doing really important work, both recovering and beyond recovery, to make available what Robert Warrior calls like the intellectual patrimony, right, of Native nations. So vital. I also want to take a moment here to revise my own point about reading like settler colonial texts and not having like at your fingertips through close reading alone an understanding of what more needs to be considered, where to look, what other kinds of resources to consult. Because of course, as you brought up in the Lewis and Clark journals, right, it's not just sitting with those kinds of materials or ancillary materials in an archive that's important, and that is too, and was to you, and has been to you. But at the same time, I'm reminded through teaching them and reading them myself that they're actually, you know, as much as they're invested in like Jefferson's vision of like making available in writing, like, you know, this Enlightenment universalist knowledge of the land, at the same time, dang it all, like, look at how much they're writing where they're literally telling us, hey, we have Indigenous interlocutors who are sharing their knowledge, and doing so in ways that draws upon their own traditions, their own traditional knowledge, even if they don't recognize what that traditional knowledge is, right? Mm-hmm. Constantly recording Sacagawea, reading the land, sharing information about flora, actually reading, right, rock formations in ways that situate her knowledge in a spatialized understanding of her history and her community's choices. So it is the case, actually, that a lot of colonial texts are not reducible to the colonialist ideologies that we are so good at teaching our students to be sensitive, close readers of. That is to say, even in their happenstance everyday recordings of everyday life, they encounter we encounter their misrecognition. And so, yeah, I just want to, you know, you had these lovely answers to my previous question, but I did think there was a kind of straw man in the way I asked it. So I wanted to correct myself.
Not at all. And that's, you know, I love what you were saying about Sacagawea and the way in which her knowledge is present. Right. I mean, it's extraordinary. And your characterization of that is, I think, conveys some of the importance and richness of these journals, which do so much. Even as they are often very anxious about how they're failing to do what they're told to do, which is to document everything in some kind of, you know, a very nationalistic kind of chauvinistic act of the projection of power. But these texts, they convey more than their putative authors know they convey. And part of, I think, our task and challenge and kind of the joy of our own discovery of these texts is figuring out how to name those places, some of the ones that you just mentioned, for example, and to recognize where they come from and how texts are these open-ended sorts of artifacts that register the influence of a lot of different things, not just one author in control of that text, right? They capture things, they catch things, and you can figure out how to place them in relationship with other kinds of things that take you beyond the space of that text and the zone of authorial control into a larger sphere of representations and networked relationships. I love the term you mentioned, Robert Allen Warrior, earlier, and his notion of intellectual patrimony. For me, part of that, he's been an inspiration to my work, and part of that intellectual patrimony is following what he calls, in a related term of his that that has stuck with me, the intellectual trade routes, right, of early America, and that term, you know, lets us follow and build kind of networks of association, networks of connection, networks of epistemology, understandings of place and locality that orient these texts to other coordinates, right? Than the ones that the people who are writing them, you were talking misrecognition. They often don't even know where they are. I sort of often joke that like a subtitle for all of my texts, all the things I write about would be like, or white men getting lost, right? Because I write so much expeditionary narratives in which people are either confusing the Arkansas River for the Canadian River, they're not sure which one they're on, or it's Bartlett at the boundary and they discover that El Paso is not where it's supposed to be on the map. So what do? They're lost, right? Or the people approach, Coronado approaching Hawaku in 1540, and they are lost and don't know what time it is, right? As they are approaching Zuni in 1540. I mean, and all of these moments of misrecognition are in a way signs of a failure of one kind of colonial text to fully inhabit itself in its authoritative intentionality. But they're also points of contact with indigenous worlds that index relationships within those worlds that I think can become much richer and become available to newer understandings if we take the time to think about how to get beyond the text from these incidentally archived moments into other ways of thinking, other ways of knowing, to indigenous.
Yeah, it's those other ways of thinking that enlivens the interpretive act, enlivens our senses to these intersecting ways of knowing, however imperfectly, present they are in one particular person's writing.
Mm-hmm. The story I was telling about, like how this book came along. When having survived graduate school and written a dissertation, I felt like I knew a whole lot about one particular thing, and then I ended up in a part of the world that was like, I don't know anything about where I live now. I mean, I was literally a white man, like kind of lost in the desert, not knowing, moving to El Paso, Texas, but not knowing anything about the literary history of this place that I was been hired to teach, literary history, and so I had to kind of figure out, and part of compensating for that and overcoming that enabled a critical review of in some ways the failings of my own graduate education to bring me to a place that that ultimately failed to contact the lives of my students and the lives of the life of the Southwest in any meaningful way, right?
I think this is a perfect opportunity then to ask a matter for your students and mine too, which is about linguistic diversity. So obviously you've written a book about settler encounters with linguistic diversity, recognized or unrecognized, from chapter to chapter. Certainly that's the case with your work on Tecumseh and Hunter. I want to ask you a question first specifically about the chapter that I assigned to my students, but I also want to ask you a more general question about teaching and students in general. So the first question is, I was hoping you could share more of a request, is share a bit about how you would teach speeches by Tecumseh. So, we could read your chapter, and I guess that's one way to teach, and I'm doing it right now. But, when you're teaching the survey, when you're teaching undergraduates, and when close readings of the language alone of these speeches purportedly by Tecumseh alone don't necessarily illuminate what's at stake for the orators or their audiences, like when that's the case, what do you do? What do you do for your students? What do you hope that they gain from that encounter with what is on the page and what a close reading might yield?
Yeah. Let me mention a couple of examples. One, at the risk of repeating some stuff that you already know from having read that chapter in this class, I like teaching that text. I like teaching Tecumseh's speech that is before the Osages that Hunter recorded and published in his memoirs in 1823, because of the way he introduces it as a literary artifact that fails because of its literariness, right? He says, I do not remember it verbatim, right? But if I could, it would only be a shadow without the substance, right? the bones without the rounding flesh of its integuments. Because what would be missing, even if you had exactly the words that he uttered on that day, and it was transcribed exactly as it was spoken, what you would miss would be the majority of that communication event. Because the majority of that communication event, according to Hunter, was comprised of a whole ensemble of signifying activities that had to do with his body, Tecumseh's body, literally the way he is gesturing and signifying, and also the way it is received in the social scenario of the Osage people who are listening to that speech on that day. And I think that is just such an important lesson for every Indigenous speech that you may find in, I was pulling out some popular editions of Great Speeches of Native Americans, the Dover edition that I've got, Bladesell's edition, or this one. W.C. Vanderworth's Indian Oratory, right? These are the popular ones that have, they're very compelling archives of oral events in a way. They have a lot of very important speeches that are worth knowing and worth becoming familiar with, but all of them are acts of radical dislocation and that misrepresent because they allied so much of what happened in that event and also what brought it to the realm of print discourse, right? So these are things, and I know your colleague, Dr. Frank Kelderman, has written a lot about oratory in the context of Indian diplomacy in the 19th century, right? And so much of what happens in those diplomatic scenarios involve interpreters. They involve events that take a very long time to transact because they go back and forth through different stages of interpretation and different stages of transcription, often through multiple parties, before they end up in a kind of colonial record that may then be excerpted and cut down further still to end up in an anthology. So trying to recover some of that stuff, how it actually went down on that day, right? To understand the nature of oratory as something that's not simply a literary record, which is how many people many white people, I should say, in the 19th century, who first began to prize and to sort of fetishize Indigenous oratory, they did so by abstracting it into a literary medium and circulating and recirculating things, following Jefferson and this better than anybody, Jefferson and Logan, right? And the way that speech was recirculated again and again and again in the print archive of the 19th century, purely as a literary text, right? One, it encourages a certain habit of reading, and it's a rewarding act of reading because you can pay attention to it as a literary text, and it's a very meaningful literary text to think about, right? But that is only one kind of act of engagement and reading that is relevant to what that thing was.
Sorry, I can't help but think that when we encounter like Logan's speech, or we encounter Tecumseh's speeches, especially speech of the Osages, Hunter's, right? Tecumseh come Hunter speech. So often they're anthologized in ways that decontextualize that communicative context, right? Indeed, the fact that maybe closely reading the speech yields insight into the communicative event in ways that extend beyond the words on the page. Ironically, through the remediation of the words on the page themselves, from, say, Hunter's memoir to a cluster of texts in the Norton Anthology,
right?
Actually, suggests that maybe just doing your homework in terms of publishing history can reveal
absolutely
the value, the continuing generative possibility of close reading when texts are reinserted into a prior, form of its mediation, or we encounter that historical media,
right?
Instead of just relying upon later day publishing.
The recontextualization is such a rewarding exercise of reading because it reminds you to think seriously and actually to work through the problem of orality versus literacy, which sounds like a simpler dichotomy than it is, and it is such a richer topic to explore if you have the opportunity to historicize and to think through all of these different layers of exchange and abstraction that take place between oral utterances in the diplomatic scenario or tribal scenario and something that's like an anthology. Another example that comes to mind that we I mentioned briefly in an earlier conversation is I think an instructive to place alongside this one, which is a moment in which you have a 19th century text in which an author is attempting to simulate some of those dynamics of oral exchange, right? And what it means to confront indigenous language. But in this case, it is such a strange simulation that it again is something that becomes richer with when you work with it as a text. And what I'm thinking of in particular is Black Hawk's autobiography. And at the beginning of Black Hawk's autobiography, which was published in 1833 in Cincinnati, so Black Hawk is, as I know you know, as your students may know also, he was Sauk, and he was the political leader of what came to be known as Black Hawk's War, which was a major event in along the river in Illinois. And sorry, I'm losing track of my train of thought, but the point of the text I want to draw your attention to is that it opens with a presentation of what looks like Sauk speech, and it's a phonetic representation of the Sauk language, supposedly the voice of Black Hawk. It's like 170 different words and like 500 syllables, I think, that are laid out there. Following on the previous page, a short letter of certification by the interpreter at the Sauk agency, Antoine Leclerc, and then you turn the page after that, and presumably it's the translation of that speech that you see only in an indigenous sort of phonetic representation of the Sauk language. And what's so odd about it is that it is offered as if it is there to simulate something that you might experience for the Eastern reader if you were there, right? If you were encountering Black Hawk in jail when he gave these interviews, right, that became his autobiography. This is an ad told to autobiography. Black Hawk himself was not alphabetically literate, so he, with the aid of this interpreter, told his story to the publisher of this book, a guy named John Patterson, who then wrote out the memoir himself and published it. So it's there to simulate that moment, as if you were there at the time. But it's such a weird way to do it, right? I mean, for that reader, who is encountering this and doesn't know the Sauk language, it's going to be it's an imposing edifice of untranslated indigenous speech, right? And so this looks like an encounter that is immediate. But of course, it's a weird artifact because at no moment in that process of interview and transcription and of writing was there ever any such document when the interpreter was writing in phonetic Sauk what he heard from Black Hawk, right? He's writing it to give to Patterson, or interpreting it for Patterson, who doesn't speak doesn't speak this language and needs to write out something in English. He doesn't need something that's written in Sauk phonetically for him to grapple with. It's going to be incomprehensible to him. So there's a way in which the literary record is a very compelling sort of problem to think through in the way that it chooses to represent, especially for Eastern readers, what empire looks like, what diplomatic exchange looks like, what encounters with indigenous people look like. But it does through a strange kind of sleight of hand by fictionalizing a reality that has no actual textual basis in its original moment.
What you just said is a really good reminder of a point that you make in the chapter about Hunter's own investment in translation, which is that it's not an investment in a kind of like perfectly analogous, perfectly communicated transition from one linguistic context to another that matters, right? It's not a kind of mirroring by translation that matters. It's the way that, any kind of act of translation is itself bound up in like the social norms of literary form, if it's translation into writing, or knowing or not knowing the norms of Plains Indian Sign Language. It's this larger way in which existing forms and social agreement on what forms constitute produce the very utterance that you seek to embody and enact and utter. And it reminds me that when we ask our students to encounter a text like Black Hawk or Tecumseh's speeches or 20th century writing by Gloria Anzaldúa, right? Just like a greatest hit and a total banger. We often ask students who don't necessarily have the knowledge of particular languages that are key contexts for something we're assigning them to go ahead and do some interpreting, right? And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your own experiences of centering matters of linguistic diversity and interaction when many students themselves are not fluent in languages beyond English, or at least not fluent in the languages that inform the assigned texts.
Right. And I'm very upfront in the first place about acknowledging my own drastic limitations on that score. I don't speak and I don't know any of these indigenous languages. I don't speak Shawnee. I don't speak Osage. Right. These belong to different language families, in fact. But it's often the case down here in El Paso, and I think around the country that students they're often way ahead of me. I'm often humbled by the sensitivity of my students to some of these questions about language, because they understand so much of this so deeply, because it forms a part of their everyday experience all of their lives, right? I mean, the English department is like a mile from the U.S.-Mexico border, and most of and so UTEP is like an 80% Hispanic student population, mostly a local population of students who grew up here and whose families are from here and have families on both sides of the border, right? Going back generations. And so most of my students are multilingual with varying degrees of competency in both English and Spanish, right? But they are acutely conscious of what is at stake in the cultural dynamics of multilingual environments, and what it means to translate, what it means to fail to translate, how often they see in their day-to-day lives the comical and problematic consequences of translations that fail. And so they understand the stuff deeply and well. And I think, our world is multilingual, right? And it has been. It's that's one of the realities of the political worlds that I was writing about that was so compelling to me in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, particularly in the Great Lakes region. And the tension there, I think, is against a federal policy that in many ways attempted to enforce boundaries of difference and division between indigenous peoples on the basis of supposed on the basis of oral linguistic difference, on the assumption that there's only one language that goes with one person, and if that's who you are, then you must be a separate people and you have no connection to the other, and therefore you should be recognized as a different nation, which if you are recognized at all, which is, of course, a strategy for dividing people and turning them against one another, but also betrays the larger truth of that world, which was multilingual and diverse. And there were just so many different communication practices that were commonplaces of everyday life, between oral and sign languages to different kinds of written discourse and that circulated across all sorts of different boundaries. And that's kind of what the world looks like here, right? From where I am speaking to you now, right? There are just a lot of different languages, and my students are experienced in moving between worlds and understanding that the divisions between languages don't correspond to other kinds of divisions that they experience, that are expressions of power that comes from other locations.
What you just said about students' experiences of translating, of being mistranslated, of encountering people who are having a moment of recognition of their failure to translate, reminds me that their everyday living like the early American ethnological nightmare scenario, which is that you can't use, a record of a singular language to make a universalist claim for the history of a people. That kind of like highly racial, mono-racialized understanding of a people is a kind of deadening, right? A foreclosure of so many possible futures, including multi-ethnic ones, with people monolingual or unilingual. What a shame, and they're experiencing really kind of the fever dreams of early American ethnology, even today, and other should not recognize. Maybe that leads me to a question then about the present. I had a lovely conversation about method and archive and Tecumseh and Hunter and the work that you've done in Ethnology and Empire. And I'm wondering a little bit about how your interests in how crises of knowledge over translation or over the recognition or not of the linguistic content of sign language, just these moments of knowing or not knowing, a moment of untranslatability or a crisis of encounter with other ways of knowing and not being able to make heads nor tails of it. I wonder if you could connect these matters that you historicize so beautifully in your book to modern day issues of linguistic performance, translation, and language diversity. We've talked about in the classroom. I wonder if you might connect it to literature you're reading now, literature you're teaching now that's not early American, or maybe in American culture context more generally.
That's a really good question. One text that comes to mind, and this could go in a lot of different directions. I feel like we could have one very long 3-hour conversation about this one question in particular, but I'll mention one text that I was working with my graduate students last night that is not exactly contemporary, but is certainly more recent than early America, which is the Yakima poet Simon Ortiz, his 1982 book From Sand Creek, which is an incredibly powerful work that deals in the first instance with what the title announces, how to bear witness to and to offer testimony about, to bear witness to the testimony of the massacre at Sand Creek in 1864 in Colorado in the vicinity of Fort Lyons, which is a place where he was in residence as a patient for an extended period when he was a veteran. And he writes about, and so we read that text alongside another text that he wrote when he gave the keynote speech, I think in 2008 at Native American Indigenous Studies Association, about language and what it means to write in English as an Indigenous writer, right? And the problem that a lot of Indigenous writers contend with and think about, which is what it means to write in English, and the notion that, as other people have put it, he was quoting Joe Harjo in particular in that essay about speaking the enemy's language, and in that he quoted from an essay or a poem rather, from Seamus Heaney, which he imagines James Joyce, the ghost of James Joyce, telling him that the English language belongs to us, right? One Irish writer telling another, the English language is ours. It belongs to us. And Ortiz's point in that keynote address, among other things, was to affirm the existence of Indigenous people, to affirm the importance of what he calls continuance, right? Of carrying stories into the future, and what it means to speak across linguistic boundaries, to speak on behalf of others, to speak in terms of not speaking for them, but speaking to champion them, to remember them, and it was a really compelling conversation that, again, for our students, turned a lot in many ways about on translation. and how to think about the untranslatability of the past, right? I mean, I think one of the compelling dynamics of is the way the linguistic problem questions and questions of poetic representation, the poetics of working with horrific acts of violence, and making how to make something legible that is and should be unspeakable because it is obscene in its violence. Working through those linguistic questions are in many ways working through the most powerful ethical questions we have about relating to the past, and how we do so not just as individuals, but across boundaries of cultural, tribal, ethnic, racial difference, right? National difference. He's connecting often, Sand Creek to Vietnam, or to the IRA, right? And or to post-colonial politics of Africa. He wants us to think about the global South and our future now, our multi-ethnic futures, the possible multi-ethnic futures that lie before us, in a way that is resonant with, recognizes, and can see and be informed by our recognition of our past and complicities in colonial violence, right? But he does so, and this is, I think, one of the thing that first prompted this text of mine when you asked your question. He does so. San Marquis is an Acoma poet, and he's writing about the massacre of Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples as someone at a particularly dark point in his own life, when he's far away from home, right? When he is a stranger in another's country, and he's trying to find a language for talking about what it means to be an ethical stranger in another's country, and to recognize his connection to the history of violence that is so much a part of that landscape. And asking very fundamental, very straightforward questions about how to be as a human being on this piece of land on which I find myself, right? And that question, stated as simply as he breaks it down in that poem, and as straightforwardly breaks it down just in those terms, is genuinely profound, right? And it's one in which I think for him the answer entails everything that we've been talking about. It entails thinking knowledgeably and sensitively about language and translation, what can be shared, what cannot be shared, what gets lost in translation, the untranslatability of the past, right? This other country, and how we deal with what it is that we can no longer know, right?
Yeah, these quandaries that you're highlighting for us in the writing of Ortiz and the talk that he gave are the very quandaries and frustrations and moments of misrecognition or ethical problematics for which Tecumseh is trying to find solutions, right? In part in using sign language to communicate with indigenous audiences to his speaking while Harrison was present. And it's an amazing moment of like, who is this speech for? Who is this writing for? Well, what the linguistic acts, right? The communicative acts, combinatory, multimedial, embodied, that Tecumseh was engaging in was not just to engage the patriarch of a colonial center. Mm-hmm. It was also to communicate and suture together this pan-Indian alliance in a moment where Harrison had tried to tear it apart by naming nations as by definition unalliable, right? That's not really a word, but right. He really tried to tear asunder like the weaving together of an alliance with his rhetoric. And for us, it is the FUBU of pan-Indian linguistic acts, for us, by us, for those you know. I think that's also what you just told us is a really great recommendation for getting into the historiography of Indigenous intellectual thought. And that particular text by Ortiz that you mentioned reminds us that historiography is part of a continuous genealogy, right? It's not like a linear progression of knowledge. It's not a supersession of like one theory over another. It is him recursively articulating, but with a difference, traditional knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. It's so important to recognize that Ortiz and Tecumseh are asking and dealing with a lot of the same quandaries and questions, right? But with a difference in their own time.
Yeah, I mean,
These are
I think, I mean, the questions, at least the things that both of these tests ask us to think about and to pay heed to and to recognize and work through and to elaborate are very similar. I mean, also, I mean, I think this text it does very different things, right? I mean, Tecumseh is trying to Harrison is refusing him. He's refusing to recognize who Tecumseh says he is and who the people that he represents say they are. He's saying, you're not one people. If you are one people, God would have put one language in your heads and you all would speak the same, but you speak different languages until you're not one people. I refuse to recognize who you are. And that refusal of recognition is what prompts Tecumseh's rejoinder, because that is a misrepresentation of their reality and it's not true, right? And his rejoinder is multilinguistic at once. It is embodied in his sign language. It's in the language that he's speaking in Shawnee, and it's in the fact that he has people who speak a lot of different languages behind them yet still recognize themselves as one people. But that's a very political moment that is about resistance, right? I think, and Ortiz is doing something that's, I mean, resistance is part of what it means to listen to testimony. I think, for him, anger is part of what it means to listen. But he's trying to work through how to reconcile oneself and one's relationship to other people, to white people in particular, within an environment that is hostile to him and his presence because of his indigeneity, because he's not white, and asking us to kind of recognize a commonality in a kind of shared national space that is, contrary to Harrison, that is shared and multilingual, and in which we are all connected to these and entangled in these histories of violence, right? And I think Ortiz has a way of thinking about that is, to me, really interesting. I mean, there's a kind of teleology, I think, that we are asked to sort of assume as part of the bargain if we're going to listen, right? If we're going to listen to and pay heed to and recognize atrocity and genocide and things like that. Or anything, right? And the expectation, the teleology, is that somehow the act of listening will lead to reconciliation, and maybe the place that Logan is at the end of his speech, when he is, when his vengeance is spent and he is like done, right? As if somehow the act of listening and the act of witnessing, bearing witness to testimony, is something that will in itself be curative and healing and lead to something that is decathected of its historical energies, right? One of the things that's really compelling to me about Ortiz's book of poems is the way in which it is both incredibly generous in its the way he assigns weight to hope and the idea of a future that is brighter, even as alongside of it, it insists upon recognizing anger and grievance, and refuses the idea that those things can be defused or reconciled simply by the act of our commonality in sharing a political national space or a space of memory, right? Those grievances, anger, outrage, they must also survive, right?
Well, Robert, I have one more question for you, which is just simply, what's next for you in your writing, your teaching, and other intellectual pursuits?
So, thank you for asking that. Well, a few different things. I mean, I have a new book project that I'm working on, that has the title, tentatively at least, is American Horologics, which is about timekeeping and space making in the early American West, and is something that wants to think about literal timekeeping practices and forms of temporal orientation in particular moments of early America, recognizing their multiplicity and thinking through how time works as practice, but also as an element of literary representation. There's been a lot of, as you know, a lot of really interesting work on time in the last 10 years. And to the extent that people have talked about timekeeping, a lot of it has been on the standardization of timekeeping, right? And the way in which the standardization of timekeeping in the 19th century, sort of corresponds to things like the advent of the railroads and different practices of labor, where people are inhabiting different forms of something that is that are necessary to the composition of a national space, right? And I'm more interested in forms of temporal orientation that are prior to that are part of a multiplicitous world in which not everyone had access to watches and things like that. That are connected to, indigenous ways of thinking about time, and from things, that are connected to celestial timekeeping and animal migration, seasonality, to the kinds of timekeeping that the people on expeditions, geodetic calculations that, that surveyors are employing to make sense of the maps they're making when they are say you're Meriwether Lewis going west, or one of the other people we've been talking about marking space in the Southwest when you're actually lost and you don't know where you are. So I'm thinking about a lot of those things. So I have a book project I'm working on that's leading me in a few different directions. And then at UTEP, we are putting together, I'm on the core faculty of a new program, a new minor that we just became official this year, Native American Indigenous Studies. And so one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time with here at UTEP is developing that program with my colleagues in different departments as something that is going to, that is imagined in the first instance to have a stronger investment in our placement in indigenous country in the Paso del Norte region than we've had as a university previously, right? So we've been spending a lot of time reaching out and trying to develop the social and collaborative infrastructure with tribal nations at Isla del Sur Pueblo, for example, and with other tribes locally to build something that's going to transform our institution, to change the way we think about Native American Indigenous studies as something that is only and belongs in academic precincts, but as something that is connected to our communities here, which I think is necessary and important. So that's something we're working on down here that I'm really excited about.
Anytime someone wants to go beyond the land acknowledgement, I'm on board.
Right.
That sounds really wonderful work. Thank you for doing that with you and your colleagues. Well, thank you again for joining me in this conversation, Robert. It was really generous of you to wax poetic on favorite work and provide wonderful advice to not only my students, but myself. Thanks for taking the time.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'm a big fan of your work. So I look forward to more conversations like this one down the road.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. So long.